So you've probably heard a lot about contracts. Maybe you've even signed one. Maybe your favorite basketball player just signed one, and now he's making more money in one day than you'll make in your entire lifetime. And maybe you're just a little pissed off, and maybe you're sick of the inequality. You're a student, damn it. That takes just as much talent as dribbling.
Well, anyway, whatever your exposure to contracts, you're sure to be able to apply the following discussion to them. And you'll also learn about how contracts fit into the world of business law. Excited?
A contract is a legally enforceable promise or set of promises.
Contract law determines what promises are enforced, whether promises have been performed, and remedies for breaches of contract. These remedies are basically compensation for or fixes to the breached part of the contract.
Confused? Don't be. We'll go into more detail in a second. In this section, we're going to look at the major issues surrounding contracts. They're split into 7 stimulating, borderline, mind-blowing sections. So, what is a contract? Well, we'll begin to answer that question by first looking at these sections.
A, we'll look at the sources of contract law. B, we'll go over the requirements for a valid contract. C, we'll discuss 2 alternative theories of enforcing promises. D, we'll cover the performance of parties to contracts. E, we'll give you tips on defenses for breach contracts should you ever find yourself in a bind. F, we'll discuss remedies for breach of contract. And lastly, G, we'll go over the rights of the third parties affected by contracts.
Let's get the ball rolling with Section A, the sources of contract law.
The sources of contract law are the Uniform Commercial Code and common law. Let's go over each one, looking at how and when they are applied to contract law.
The Uniform Commercial Code was created mainly for the purpose of establishing a uniform set of rules to govern commercial transactions. In other words, before the code was proposed, each state had its own commercial laws, and they were often inconsistent.
Companies had to comply with and be subjected to the separate laws of each state in which they did business. So the UCC attempts to unify the national marketplace.
The UCC has been adopted nearly in its entirety by 49 states and in part by Louisiana. So as a uniform act, it's coming very close to its goal of making trade laws uniform on a national level. It's almost there, but not quite. In other words, it's almost uniform.
The UCC covers a broad range of commercial transactions, but when we talk about the UCC in this tape, we're talking about Article 2, which is the law of the sale of goods. The UCC applies to every contract that specifies the sale of goods. Basically, what we're talking about when we use the term goods are tangible things that people buy and sell. Services like back massages. Oh, yeah, that feels good. But they're not goods. And goods also aren't things that can't be moved, like real estate.
When you make a purchase, you become a party to a Uniform Commercial Code, or UCC contract. If you steal something, on the other hand, that is a crime. You will pay dearly. Your guilt will haunt you, unless Bruno here finds you first.
So, the UCC only applies to goods. Now, when we hired our actors, that was a contract for services and not goods, and therefore was not a UCC sales contract. For this introduction to business law, it would be beyond the scope of the discussion to go into the detailed points of the UCC. But if you're curious, or your professor's really throwing the bones at you, then you can find a copy of the document at a library, or on the internet, or in the bartender's Bible.
All other contracts that don't include the sale of goods are governed by the common law or by other parts of the UCC. Remember, for our purposes, goods are all that is covered by the UCC. And so, contracts that don't cover goods cover things that aren't goods. These are things that can't be moved geographically. So the second source of contract law covered things that aren't goods or things that can't be moved geographically, like land or services. This second source of contract law is common law.
All right, now reach way back into that cerebellum of yours. And remember that common law is case law, or law that is made up of court decisions. The contract disputes, which common law covers, are contracts that aren't covered by the Uniform Commercial Code. These things include stuff such as land sales or services. You're probably wondering why land isn't considered a good. Well, quite simply, you're not going to find many pieces of land that are sold and bought and actually moved someplace else.
Okay, let's look at a case that illustrates common law and its application to contracts. We offer to the people the case of Jack's drywall problem. This is one example of how common law might be applied to a contract.
You see, this is a case about a service that was not performed correctly. And remember, this case would fall within common law because a service isn't a good. In common law, there are past cases that deal with services that were not performed the way the person wanted them. So, there are past decisions made by judges which can be applied to this case. Therefore, this case can be settled by the common law of contracts.
Mel the drywaller was contracted by Jack to drywall Jack's living room. Only thing was that Mel decided the living room looked nice in urban decay and decided instead to drywall the bedroom, which has a few water stains in the corners of the ceiling. Well, Mel did a crappy job. Not to mention, he did the wrong job. So, he broke the contract in which he was to drywall the living room. And, based on past court cases in common law, Jack can refuse payment to Mel even though he did drywall something. In addition, Jack is entitled to receive the monetary equivalent of the damage done to his bedroom.
So we just gave you a neat little case about common law and contract disputes. Before that, we mentioned that the UCC also covers contract disputes involving goods.
Section B, requirements for a valid contract.
Hey, muchacho. This second section in contract law covers the requirements for a valid contract. What is a valid contract? Well, a contract is valid when it meets all of the requirements for the formation of a contract. These requirements are what we're going to tell you all about. The four main requirements for a valid contract are legal capacity, legality, agreement, and consideration. We'll go over these requirements in detail.
The first of these contract requirements is legal capacity. That means the person signing the contract must be at least 18 years old and mentally competent. The second contract requirement is legality. That means the contract must be for a legal purpose. No gambling or murder for hire.
We will review these first two requirements again when we discuss defenses for breach of contract. But for this particular discussion, we will be spending most of our time on agreement and consideration. So, let's look at these last two requirements. Shall we? The agreement.
An agreement is a mutual acceptance of the contract's contents by both sides.
So let's go through each in detail, starting with the offer.
The offer is a proposal by one person to another. The offer is intended to create a legal relationship between these two people once the offeree accepts. And what's an offeree? Well, when it comes to contract law, there are two players, the offerer and the offeree. The offerer makes the offer. The offeree will accept or not accept the offer. So, each of these roles must exist in the agreement. And first, of course, there must be an offer.
The process of making an offer requires that the terms are clear. The offeree needs to know exactly what is being proposed. Making an offer is kind of like playing tennis. The ball starts in the offerer's side of the court. Once the offer is made, it gets sent into the offeree's side of the court. So think of the offer as the ball. And once this offer is made to the offeree, something called power of acceptance comes into play. Power of acceptance means that the offer is now being controlled by the offeree. The offeree may either take the ball or hit it back.
Hey, you! What are you doing? Come back here with the ball!
Of course, when actually playing the game of tennis, it probably isn't a very good idea to pocket the ball and then go and think about all the different ways you may want to return it.
Backhand, forehand, nuclear fission, airdrop, overnight delivery, counteroffer.
Now the offer's been made. The offeree is able to look it over and consider whether or not he wants to be part of the deal. So acceptance is the second requirement for an agreement.
Acceptance occurs when the offeree communicates his assent to the offer. In other words, it's when the offeree says,
Yeah, okay, that sounds cool.
once the offer is accepted, then there is an agreement.
Yeah, okay, that sounds cool.
There are 3 points to make regarding acceptance, which is the second stage of agreement. Let's take a look at these points and see what goes into acceptance.
Yeah, okay, that sounds cool.
3 important points regarding acceptance are the form which acceptance takes, when acceptance actually occurs, and when offers are terminated.
First, when we talk about what form the acceptance takes, we mean what kind of communication the offeree uses to accept the offer.
Any form of communication will work. It can be almost anything that someone in the offerer's position would consider to be consent. This could be oral or written words, nodding of the head, Morse code, or skywriting. You see, unless the person that made the offer said the acceptance had to be in a specific form, any reasonable form will make a contract.
The second point in acceptance says that acceptance is effective as soon as the message leaves possession of the offeree. Now, there's a rule that explains this called the mailbox rule. Basically, the mailbox rule says, unless an offer requires a different form of acceptance, as soon as a letter of acceptance is in the mail, the offeree's acceptance is effective.
How you doing?
Hi. So acceptance is effective as soon as it leaves possession of the offeree. The minute you say yes, the deal has begun. So it's like our tennis game. Acceptance is when the guy who receives the ball decides to send it back to the guy who first hit it to him. And the ball can be returned in almost any way, via mail or propulsion. Of course, overnight delivery probably won't fly with most tennis games.
Morning.
Oh, yeah. It's about time.
There's a third point to be aware of when you talk about acceptance, and that point is the time limit of the offer. Offers don't just hang around and wait for you to decide whether or not you want to accept. Offers terminate after all different lengths of time. For example, the cue card I'm reading will self-destruct in 10 seconds.
You can't assume when someone offers to make a deal with you that the deal will always be available. Sometimes offers, just like marriage proposals, don't last very long. Offers disappear and so do potential spouses. There are many reasons why an offer may terminate. We'll look at several of these reasons in a moment.
So when an offer comes your way, you must realize it may disappear in a short period of time, or a medium period of time, or it may never terminate. But you better be aware of how long you have to decide whether or not to accept an offer. So let's leave agreements and move on to the other requirement for a valid contract, consideration.
Consideration is defined as something of legal value which is given in exchange for something else.
Okay, let's make sure you're not too far off the beaten track. This shouldn't be too much of a hike as long as you've got some sturdy shoes on and good tread on your brain. Excellent. Now, this consideration thing basically means that in order for a contract to be enforceable, there's got to be something that each party gives up in the deal. The things that are consideration include money, property, or services.
Take Mel, the professional drywaller again. Well, do you think he's going to drywall for free? Nope. He wants a promise that he'll get paid. Consideration's got to be there for each party if there's going to be an exchange. And without an exchange, there's no contract.
So, if you want to enforce someone's promise, it helps if you give some consideration for it. When someone promises you something, it's easier to get them to perform or give you what is promised if you also promise something. Remember, no consideration, no contract.
Now, while we're talking about consideration, there are several things that you should know. First off, there are 2 ways to recognize consideration. And secondly, there are some agreements which lack consideration. We'll look at both of these things right now.
Let's go over how to tell if there's consideration when there's supposed to be. You see, if consideration is part of what is needed to make a valid contract, then we've got to figure out whether or not it's there. Again, no consideration, no contract. There are 2 important ways to determine the existence of consideration. First, there's the legal detriment. And second, there's the peppercorn theory of consideration. We'll start with the legal detriment.
Sounds pretty scary, huh? Detriment. Boo! Yeah, well, the law is a pretty frightening subject, unless you eat it before it eats you. So let's chew the legal detriment fat. Now, the concept which underlies legal detriment basically says that there is no binding contract without consideration.
So, legal detriment is to give consideration. Someone must either give up an existing right or accept a new duty. Well, basically this means you don't get something for nothing. You get something for something. Each party that is bound to a contract must be giving up something for what they are going to receive from the other party.
For example, Mel's promise to drywall Jack's living room is the acceptance of a new duty, which is a form of consideration. So that promise is legal detriment, and legal detriment is the giving of consideration by one party to another.
The other party, Jack in this case, is obligated to also give some type of consideration outlined in the contract.